The last of the cell types is called the alveolar macrophage, and the macrophage is your immune system or your protector cell. So this is what is going to get rid of any potential damaging materials as well as potential pathogens. And macrophages, if you remember, are antigen-presenting cells. So once they engulf and digest a pathogen, they will then present it to our immune system, and then our immune system can respond. So here are the different cell types. We have our flattened type 1 alveolar cells. We have our cuboidal type 2 alveolar cells that produce surfactant, and then we have our alveolar macrophages right there. And so here you have that alveolar type 1 cell, and then here's the capillary wall. Between them, they share the basement membrane, areolar connective tissue basement membrane. So there's three very thin layers, and this is why the gas exchange occurs so effectively. And that's known as the respiratory membrane between the alveolar type 1 cells and the blood capillary cells. They're each one simple squamous epithelial layer thick, and they share a basement membrane of areolar connective tissue. So oxygen moves down its concentration gradient while carbon dioxide moves down its concentration gradient. Oxygen moves into the blood, carbon dioxide moves out of the blood and into the lungs. So the last organ then is the lungs. The lungs are very large thoracic organs, the largest of our thoracic organs actually, but they're very lightweight as well. So typical lungs are so light because they have a lot of air inside of them. They have a lot of holes with air. And so when the lung, if you get, I don't want to say healthy lung tissue, but really that's what you're looking for. If you get lung tissue that hasn't been preserved, then you can actually stick it into water and it will float because of all the air that's in it. Lungs are surrounded by a pleural membrane, so this is your serous membrane, and that allows the lungs to move without any friction. So there are some disorders associated with the lungs as well. One of the clinical views talks about smoking. Smoking isn't a disorder, but it is a lifestyle choice that people get addicted to. And smoking itself can lead to disorders, including respiratory infections, chronic bronchitis, emphysema, lung cancer. It can cause problems with pregnancies. And of course, if you're smoking, you're likely not going to get as much or have as much energy because you're not getting as much oxygen to your cells. So what smoking actually does is the chemicals in the smoke are going to cause damage to the cells of your respiratory tract. And so all of those ciliated cells, the cilia starts to die. And with increased amount of smoke, so the chemicals, those ciliated cells are never going to be reproduced. So the cilia can't get reproduced, which means the mucus is just going to sit there. And that's what leads to infections and bronchitis and emphysema. Another disorder is called lung cancer. So lung cancer is a very common form of cancer, almost always caused by smoking, but that doesn't mean that if you're a smoker you will get lung cancer, or if you do not smoke you will not get lung cancer. There are genetics that are associated with cancer as well. So you can have genetics that will make you more prone to certain types of cancer. Then your lifestyle choices are going to influence the ability of you to either get cancer or not. So in my family, my mom died of lung cancer, which means I may have genes that would make me more prone to lung cancer. If I'm a smoker, I'm more likely to get lung cancer than someone who's in a family that has nobody that's ever died from lung cancer. Does that make sense? And if not, ask me in class, because that's what I want you to do. I want you to bring questions to class so that I can answer them. Okay? Pleurisy, I'm sorry, I'm going to cut one of my, I have a hangnail. Pleurisy is inflammation of the pleural lining. So we have this serous membrane called the pleural membrane, and if it gets inflamed, it can actually lead to a lot of pain and discomfort when breathing, when coughing. Oftentimes this is associated with infections, but it can also be associated with chemicals. So if you're breathing in chemicals at a workplace, that can cause you to get pleurisy. If you have pleurisy, it's very painful, but there's no real treatment other than painkillers, and the painkillers are most likely going to be low-level painkillers. A pleural effusion occurs when within that pleural cavity you get excess fluid. So this can cause your lung to actually start to collapse, which is why this lung looks smaller. So we have all this fluid buildup. Reasons for this can be some type of accident caused your pleural lining to start leaking. But you could also have infections like, can I think of it? Influenza. There you go. I couldn't think of it for some reason. And lung cancer can actually cause this. And there's an actual figure showing a pleural effusion. Pneumothorax occurs when air gets into the pleural lining. So if you get air, then that also can cause your lung not to be able to inflate, and it can actually collapse. Oftentimes, or treatment is going to be by getting a chest tube that will release the excess air or fluid, if you have fluid in there, and that's going to allow the lung to be able to re-expand. That typically is very painful. My mom actually had a pneumothorax, and they had a chest tube in her, and she complained a lot about how much pain that caused her. And then atelectasis is a collapsed lung. So that's just the term. Atelectasis means collapsed lung. And this occurs oftentimes when the pleural pressure is greater than it's supposed to be. So the intrapleural pressure should be lower than the pulmonary pressure. So if it increases, it can cause the lung to actually deflate. Oftentimes this is associated with, again, your pleural effusion, your pneumothorax, or with severe trauma. So again, I talk about my mom a lot in this because she had all these lung problems. So she was hit, she was in a car, she was hit by a truck driving very quickly down a road. She was on the passenger side, that's where the truck hit, and it caused damage to her lungs, and her lung deflated. That actually started all of her problems. A lot of times when you have cancer in your lungs, those cancer cells may not be growing very fast, but if some trauma occurs, that can stimulate or start the growth of these new cells. So the last one I like to talk about is emphysema. Emphysema is the damage to the alveoli. So you lose alveolar surface, and you lose the elasticity of the lungs. So you have lung elastic fibers that typically allow your lungs to inflate, deflate, inflate, deflate. When the elasticity wears out, then you inflate and you're not going to be able to deflate very effectively. With the alveoli damage, so here's normal alveoli, here's what emphysema alveoli look like. Instead of having each of these tiny little pockets, you have large pockets. We have a lower surface area for gas exchange to occur, and that will cause us not to get enough oxygen to our tissues. Also, because we can't deflate those lungs, we're not getting carbon dioxide out effectively. So it's a very serious disorder associated with, again, most of the time smoking, but that doesn't mean you won't have it or you can't get it if you don't smoke. There's other causes can lead to emphysema. Other things can lead to emphysema. Oftentimes, you'll see elderly people pushing on their thoracic cavity. So they're kind of pushing upwards, kind of like if you were to see someone that was having the Heimlich. And what they're doing is they're helping to decrease their thoracic cavity size so that they can push more air out, so that they can then take more oxygen in. So now we're going to start talking about actual breathing, so the physiology behind what our respiratory system does. So what is breathing? There are two definitions for pulmonary ventilation. One is just breathing. The other is the amount of air moved from the environment through the lungs in 1 minute. A respiratory cycle is one complete inspiration and expiration. And each respiratory cycle has 4 different things happening. These don't happen one after another. They all happen simultaneously. So everything is occurring all the time. And so here we have air that contains oxygen that's going to be moving into our lungs during our inspiratory phase. When air moves into the lungs, oxygen moves into the blood from the air. Oxygen then moves to our tissues and moves from the blood into our cells so that we can produce ATP. Carbon dioxide produced as a byproduct of aerobic respiration moves into the blood and travels to the lungs. And at the lungs, carbon dioxide moves from the blood into the alveoli so that it can be excreted through expiration. So this whole process is constantly occurring. So pulmonary ventilation is breathing. And there are different types of breathing. There's quiet breathing. So when you're sitting at home watching a movie and you're just breathing, that's quiet breathing. And in that case, you're using energy to pull air in, but expiration is a passive process. There's also forced breathing. So if you're breathing during exercise, that's going to use more energy, and in both the inspiratory and expiratory activity, you're going to use ATP energy. The muscles that are used for breathing are skeletal muscles, but this occurs through the autonomic nervous system, so we do not consciously think about breathing to have our breathing occur. So if I want to move my arms up, that's conscious. I'm moving my arms because I want to move them. But our autonomic nervous system controls processes that we don't tend to think about. We breathe without thinking about it. And so I'm going to talk about the different muscles associated with breathing and how this process occurs in our next video.